Ethan was a quiet young man who loved music more than anything else. He grew up in a small neighborhood where every day was a struggle. His father worked long hours in a factory, and his mother cleaned houses just to keep food on the table. While other kids played in the streets, Ethan would sit by an old broken window and listen to the sound of rain, imagining it as a melody. He had no expensive piano, only a small second-hand keyboard with missing keys, yet his fingers could make it sing like magic. One evening, after finishing his shift at a small cafe, Ethan found an elegant white envelope slipped under the cafe door. The paper was thick, the handwriting beautiful, and the golden seal on it looked expensive. He opened it with trembling hands and read aloud, "You are invited to perform at the Grayson Mansion, Saturday evening." Ethan blinked, unable to believe what he was seeing. The Grayson family was the richest in the city, owners of several businesses, and known for hosting fancy parties filled with celebrities, politicians, and wealthy guests. He sat there for a long time, staring at the letter. His heart racing. Was this a dream? He had played small gigs before in street corners and local cafes, but never in front of people like them. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. The chance to finally show the world that talent didn't belong only to the rich, that music could rise from even the poorest corners of the city. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan practiced every spare moment he had. His fingers moved across the broken keyboard, imagining it was a grand piano. Sometimes the keys got stuck. Sometimes the sound cracked, but he didn't stop. He closed his eyes and played from his heart, each note filled with hope. His little sister would sit nearby, watching him silently, whispering, "You're going to make them cry." "Ethan," he would smile softly and answer, "I just want them to listen." Saturday came, and Ethan stood in front of the mirror wearing his best clothes, which weren't much. A plain white shirt, slightly faded pants, and shoes he had polished until they almost shined. He felt nervous, but something deep inside told him to go. He took the bus to the wealthy side of town, watching as the buildings changed from old brick walls to tall, shining towers. When the bus stopped in front of the Grayson Mansion, he felt small. The mansion looked like something out of a movie. Golden lights, glass walls, and luxury cars parked outside. He walked up the marble steps slowly, feeling the stares of guards and guests. Some whispered to each other, "Is that the musician they invited?" Another chuckled, "He looks like he works in the kitchen." Ethan pretended not to hear, clutching his small bag that held his music sheets at the entrance. A tall man in a black suit looked him up and down and said, "Name?" Ethan cleared his throat. "Ethan Cole, the pianist." The man raised an eyebrow but stepped aside. "Follow me." He led Ethan through a grand hallway filled with glittering chandeliers and paintings that probably cost more than his entire neighborhood. As he entered the ballroom, Ethan's eyes widened. The place was full of elegantly dressed people holding glasses of wine, laughing softly and speaking about business. Near the center stood Mr. Grayson himself, a tall man with sharp eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach his face. He looked at Ethan for a long moment before saying loudly, "Ah, the young pianist from the cafe has arrived. Everyone, this is the boy I told you about." The guests turned to look at him. Some smiled politely. Others smirked. Ethan could feel their judgment like a heavy weight on his shoulders. Mr. Grayson motioned toward a grand piano in the middle of the room. It was massive, shining under the lights, its surface smooth and perfect. Ethan felt his throat tighten. It was the most beautiful piano he had ever seen, yet something about the way everyone stared made his stomach twist. Then he heard Mr. Grayson whisper to a woman beside him, "Let's see if the street boy knows what real music sounds like." The guests chuckled quietly, and Ethan understood. The invitation wasn't meant to honor him, it was a setup. They wanted entertainment, not from his music, but from his failure. His heart sank, but he took a deep breath and walked toward the piano, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Every eye in the room followed him. He could hear people whispering, "He's trembling already. Poor thing. He'll make a fool of himself." When he sat down, his hands hovered over the keys. They were cold under his fingers. He looked up briefly and saw the amused faces. He could leave now, walk away, save himself from embarrassment. But then he remembered his mother's tired smile and his sister's words. "You're going to make them cry." "Ethan." He took another deep breath and pressed the first key. The sound filled the hall, soft but clear. It echoed gently through the air, like the first drop of rain before a storm. The laughter stopped for a moment. Ethan closed his eyes and began to play, not for them, not for fame, but for the people who had believed in him. For every lonely night he had practiced on broken keys. And for the dream that had kept him alive, the melody grew stronger, more powerful. It spoke of struggle, pain, and hope. And though this was only the beginning, something in that grand hall had already changed. The humiliation they planned had begun to fade, replaced by the first quiet stirrings of awe. Ethan didn't see it yet, but his music was about to silence every cruel smile in that room. The room was filled with quiet murmurs, the air heavy with perfume and money. People in shining suits and glittering gowns stood around crystal tables, holding glasses of golden wine. Ethan stood at the edge of the room, his fingers clutching the strap of his old music bag. He could feel eyes on him, curious, judgmental, amused. Mr. Grayson, the millionaire host, smiled widely as he walked toward Ethan, his expensive shoes tapping on the marble floor. "Welcome, Mr. Cole," he said, his tone sweet but sharp like a blade hidden behind silk. "I've heard a lot about your unique performances." The last words carried a hint of mockery. His guests chuckled quietly. Ethan nodded politely, unsure whether to smile or stay silent. Grayson placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the grand piano in the center of the hall. It was enormous, shining like a mirror, the golden lights reflecting off its polished surface. "This," said Grayson proudly, "is a Steinway Model D, worth $200,000. Let's see how it sounds under the touch of an untrained hand." The guests laughed softly, pretending to sip their drinks. Ethan's chest tightened, but he said nothing. He walked toward the piano slowly, each step echoing. The marble floor felt like ice beneath his shoes. People whispered behind him, their voices soft but cruel. "He looks lost. I bet he's never seen a real piano before." "This will be fun," someone said. Ethan placed his hand on the piano lid. The cool metal felt unfamiliar, heavier than anything he had played before. Mr. Grayson clapped his hands and said loudly, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's entertainment, a young man from the lower district, a true example of inspiration." His tone made the word sound like an insult. "He will play for us something from his little street performances." Laughter spread around the room again. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He wanted to walk out. But then he saw a small figure near the back. A young girl holding her mother's hand, watching him with wide, curious eyes. She looked just like his sister for a second. He felt warmth inside his chest again. He sat down, his hands resting above the keys. The room grew quiet for a moment, but he could still hear the faint laughter from one corner. He looked up. Mr. Grayson raised a glass and whispered something to his friend. Both of them grinning, Ethan took a deep breath. His fingers shaking slightly, the light seemed too bright. His reflection shone back at him from the glossy black piano surface. The first sound that came out was soft, a hesitant note that hung in the air like a question. Someone snickered. "He's nervous," but Ethan ignored it. He pressed another key, then another, slowly building the melody. He played the same tune he used to play for his mother when she came home exhausted from work. It was a simple melody, gentle and full of emotion. The laughter began to fade, replaced by silence, the kind that fills a room when hearts begin to listen. The music poured out of him, the pain of cold nights, the struggle of surviving, the small joys that kept hope alive. His fingers moved faster, smoother, as if the piano had always been waiting for him. He didn't look at the audience anymore. His eyes were closed, lost in the world of sound. Mr. Grayson frowned, his smirk fading as the music deepened. The tone of the piano changed. It wasn't just pleasant, it was powerful, soulful. It touched something inside the people who had been ready to laugh. One woman lowered her glass slowly. Another man blinked as if remembering something long forgotten. Ethan's rhythm grew stronger, his hands flying across the keys with passion. The melody shifted from sorrow to hope, from struggle to triumph. Every note seemed alive, telling the story of a boy who had nothing but still dared to dream. By the time he reached the final part of his piece, not a single person was speaking. The last note echoed through the hall and disappeared into the silence that followed. For a moment, nobody moved. Ethan sat there breathing heavily, his heart pounding. Then someone clapped, softly at first and then louder. The sound grew, spreading through the room like fire. Within seconds, the entire hall was filled with applause. Mr. Grayson stood frozen, his hand still holding his glass midair, his face pale. His guests looked at him confused, unsure whether to follow his lead or continue clapping. But the spell had already broken. People were moved. Some were even crying quietly. Ethan finally opened his eyes and looked around, disbelief on his face. He hadn't expected applause. He had only wanted to be heard. Mr. Grayson forced a smile, his pride wounded. He walked over and said loudly, "Well, that was unexpected." trying to sound amused, but his voice trembled. Ethan stood up and gave a small bow. He didn't need words. His music had already said everything. As he stepped away from the piano, a few guests came forward. Shaking his hand, one man said softly, "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years," a woman whispered. "You played with your soul?" Ethan smiled shyly, thanking them, but deep inside, he felt something greater. He had turned their mockery into admiration. Their laughter into silence. Mr. Grayson's eyes followed him. Cold and sharp, he was no longer laughing. Something in Ethan's music had reminded him of a truth he had long buried, that money could buy everything but heart. And for the first time that evening, the mighty millionaire felt small. Ethan walked out of the grand hall, the night air cool on his face, his heart light. He had come as a poor pianist meant to be humiliated, but he left as an artist who had made the rich remember what true beauty sounded like. His footsteps echoed softly on the stone path as he smiled to himself, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning of something far greater. The room was still echoing with the sound of clapping when Ethan quietly sat back on the piano bench, his heart still pounding, his fingers trembling not from fear anymore but from emotion. He had poured everything he had into that performance. Every painful night, every moment of doubt, every memory of his mother whispering, "Don't stop playing, Ethan, one day the world will listen." But as the applause faded, the tension in the air began to change. Some of the guests who had clapped so eagerly now shifted awkwardly, embarrassed that they had mocked him earlier. Others whispered among themselves, their voices uncertain, and at the far end of the hall, Mr. Grayson stood completely still, his eyes locked on Ethan with an unreadable expression. "Remarkable," Grayson finally said, his tone smooth but forced. "You certainly surprised us all." His smile looked polite, but there was something behind it, a mix of irritation and disbelief. The kind of look a man gives when his plan doesn't go the way he wanted. He had invited Ethan to be a joke, not a star. The servants began to move again, refilling glasses, offering snacks. The guests started talking, pretending as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone kept glancing at Ethan, trying to understand how a boy in worn-out clothes had managed to move them so deeply. Ethan, still sitting by the piano, looked down at his hands. The tips of his fingers were red, his palms slightly shaking. He didn't know what to do next. He hadn't planned for what came after the performance. He only knew that for those few minutes, he had felt truly alive then. One of the guests, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, walked toward him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said softly, "You have a gift, young man. Don't ever let people like us make you forget that." Her words warmed his heart. He nodded, unable to speak, but before he could respond, Mr. Grayson's voice cut through the air, louder now. "Well, that was lovely, but perhaps a bit too emotional for a party, don't you think?" He laughed, but no one joined him. He cleared his throat awkwardly and gestured for the band to resume playing background music. The melody that followed sounded lifeless compared to what Ethan had just played. Ethan stood up, ready to leave, but Grayson stopped him with a raised hand. "Leaving so soon? We were just getting started," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Mr. Cole, where did you learn to play like that?" "Surely not in some dusty cafe," Ethan replied quietly. "I taught myself, sir." Grayson tilted his head, pretending to be impressed. "Self-taught? How charming." He turned to his guests. "Did you hear that? No teachers, no training, just natural talent." His voice carried a faint mockery, but this time no one laughed. Instead, a few people frowned, sensing his bitterness. Trying to regain control of the room, Grayson clapped his hands again. "How about another song? Something lively, perhaps?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to stay any longer, but he could feel the audience watching him, expecting something more. He nodded slowly and sat down again. This time, he decided to play something different, something that carried not sorrow but defiance. A melody that said, "You cannot break me." His fingers danced across the keys with renewed strength. The tune was sharp, bold, alive. The rhythm filled the room like a heartbeat, fast and unstoppable. The guests stood mesmerized once again. The music climbed higher, more powerful, until even the chandeliers seemed to tremble from the vibrations. Ethan's passion turned every note into fire, burning through the arrogance that had filled the mansion earlier. As the final note echoed, Ethan lifted his hands from the keys. The silence that followed felt electric. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the applause erupted again. Louder this time. It wasn't polite. It was real. People were cheering, whistling, shouting his name. Mr. Grayson's jaw tightened. His plan to humiliate Ethan had turned into his own public embarrassment. His guests now looked at him not as a powerful man, but as a fool who underestimated a poor boy's soul. His face flushed red and he forced a smile, saying, "Well, it seems we've discovered a prodigy tonight," his voice strained. Everyone a toast to unexpected talent, but deep inside jealousy burned like poison. The man who had built his empire on control couldn't stand that this simple boy had stolen the night without wealth, without fame, without anything but truth. After the crowd settled, Ethan quietly packed his things. He didn't wait for compliments or money. He only wanted to go home. As he reached the door, the same silver-haired woman called out again, "Ethan, wait!" She approached and handed him her card. "I run a small music foundation," she said softly. "Call me tomorrow. I'd like to help you." Ethan stared at the card, speechless, his eyes glistening. "Thank you," he whispered. Her smile was genuine, something he hadn't seen much in that mansion. Mr. Grayson watched the exchange from across the room, his fists tightening. He didn't like losing control, and this boy, this nobody, had made him look weak in front of his own guests as Ethan walked out into the cool night. Grayson's voice echoed in his head, but this time he didn't feel small. He felt strong, free. Outside, the night sky was clear. The city lights sparkled below. Ethan walked down the marble steps slowly, the sound of the grand piano still echoing in his heart, every note replayed in his mind like a memory. He smiled to himself, realizing that music had given him something no one could take away: dignity. Behind him, through the mansion's glass walls, Mr. Grayson stood watching, his expression cold, calculating. This wasn't the end for him, and Ethan didn't know it yet. But the millionaire who had once tried to humiliate him wasn't done. The real test was still waiting. And the music that had lifted Ethan tonight would soon face a far darker stage. The night after the performance, Ethan could hardly sleep every time he closed his eyes. He saw the faces in that grand hall, the surprise, the awe, the quiet shame on those who had laughed at him. He could still hear the sound of applause echoing in his ears. Soft and unreal, it felt like a dream, but deep down, he knew something had changed. The next morning, Ethan woke up early and went to the cafe where he worked. The air smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee. His boss, Mrs. Hill, smiled warmly and said, "I saw the video, Ethan. You were wonderful." Ethan blinked in confusion. "Video?" he asked. She turned her phone around and showed him. Someone from the party had secretly recorded his performance and uploaded it online. The title read, "Poor Street Pianist Silences the Rich." It already had thousands of views, comments flooding in, people praising him. Who is he? This is pure emotion. He plays like his soul is speaking. Ethan didn't know what to say. His hand shook as he read the comments. Tears filled his eyes for the first time. Strangers were hearing his heart through his music. He whispered softly, "Mom, I did it," his voice breaking. By afternoon, the cafe phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists wanted interviews. Local radio stations wanted him to play live. Even schools were calling to invite him to perform for students. Mrs. Hill placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Go, Ethan, this is your moment." He smiled and nodded, though his heart felt heavy with disbelief. But not everyone was happy across the city. Inside the tall glass mansion, Mr. Grayson watched the same video on his big screen, his face twisted with anger. The very moment meant to humiliate the boy had made him famous instead. He threw his glass on the floor. The sound of shattering echoed in the empty room. "He made a fool of me," he growled. His assistant stood nearby, nervous. "Sir, maybe you can use this. Turn it into publicity for the foundation." "No!" Grayson shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. "I won't let a street kid become the face of my failure." That evening, Ethan sat by the window of his small apartment, watching the city lights flicker below. His sister ran to him with excitement. "Ethan, you're on TV," she said. He smiled and pulled her close. On the screen, a reporter was saying, "A young pianist from the poor district stunned the city's elite last night with a performance that brought them to tears. His name is Ethan Cole." His phone buzzed again, an unknown number. He answered hesitantly. A familiar voice spoke. "Mr. Cole, this is Mrs. Lane from the Music Foundation. I was at the party last night and I meant what I said. I want to sponsor your education. There's an audition next week for a scholarship, and I believe you can win it." Ethan could hardly breathe. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you," he said softly. Over the next few days, Ethan practiced harder than ever. His old keyboard keys rattled, the sound uneven, but his fingers moved with determination. His little sister would sit beside him, humming along. Sometimes he'd stop and just listen to the rhythm of the keys, feeling like the universe itself was breathing with him. Meanwhile, Mr. Grayson was planning his revenge. He told the press that Ethan had stolen his private event and used it for fame. He spread lies saying the boy had faked his story to gain sympathy. Some news channels started questioning Ethan's background. Is he really from the streets? They asked. But the people who had heard his music didn't care. They knew truth when they felt it. On the day of the scholarship audition, Ethan walked into the grand auditorium. The place buzzed with young musicians, all with perfect clothes, shiny instruments, and trained confidence. Ethan wore his same white shirt and carried his old music sheets. Some contestants looked at him and whispered, "That's the viral guy." Others laughed quietly. "Let's see if he can actually play without a camera." When his turn came, he sat before the piano. The judges looked down at him from the panel. One of them, an old man with kind eyes, said, "We've heard about you, son. Play what your heart tells you." Ethan nodded. He placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes, and once again the world disappeared. The melody that flowed was not for fame, not for revenge. It was a song about hope, about standing tall when the world expects you to kneel. Every note carried the strength of his struggle and the softness of his dreams. The judges leaned forward silent, moved when the last note faded. The room stayed still, and then applause erupted again. Loud and unstoppable, Ethan stood, tears in his eyes, and bowed. One of the judges smiled and said, "Young man, that wasn't just playing." That was truth. Outside the hall, reporters waited for him, microphones flashing, but Ethan wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about his family, his mother, his sister, and every night he had played in darkness hoping someone would listen. Now the whole world was listening, far away in his mansion. Mr. Grayson watched the audition on television, his reflection faintly visible on the screen for the first time. He didn't feel anger. He felt something else, something unfamiliar. Maybe regret, maybe envy, maybe respect. He turned off the TV and whispered to himself, "That boy, he's what I'll never be." Ethan walked home that night with a smile. His future still uncertain, but his soul shining bright. He had played through pain, silence, and laughter, and turned them all into music. His journey was far from over. But this time, the world would walk with him, not against him. The morning sunlight streamed through Ethan's small apartment window, spilling across his keyboard. His sister still slept on the couch, her hand clutching one of his old music sheets. Ethan sat quietly, staring at his phone, the screen blinking with hundreds of new messages, interview requests, congratulations, and invitations. But one message stood out. It was from Mrs. Lane, the woman who had believed in him from the start. Her message read, "Congratulations, Ethan. You've been accepted into the National Music Conservatory with a full scholarship." Your audition moved everyone to tears. Ethan froze. The words blurred before his eyes, a lump forming in his throat. His dream, something he thought was impossible, had become real. He whispered softly, "Mom, I did it," his voice trembling with emotion. His sister stirred awake and rubbed her eyes. "What happened?" she asked. Ethan turned to her, smiling through tears. "We're going to the big school, the one where real musicians go." She jumped up and hugged him tight. "I knew you could do it," she said proudly. But while the city celebrated his rise, far across town Mr. Grayson sat in his office, his expression unreadable. The morning paper lay open on his desk. The headline read, "Street Pianist Wins National Scholarship, From Mockery to Mastery." Each word stung. His assistant entered cautiously. "Sir, the press wants to know if you'll comment on your connection to Ethan Cole." Grayson leaned back in his chair and smiled coldly. "Connection? There is none," he said. "But make sure his fame doesn't last too long." His tone calm but dangerous. He had built his empire by controlling people, bending stories, shaping public opinion, and he wasn't going to let a boy from the slums ruin that. He called a few journalists he knew and began feeding them twisted stories. Claims that Ethan's performance had been staged, that his poverty was an act. Within hours, social media was filled with confusion, hashtags shifting from praise to doubt. Dr. Ethan Cole fraud began trending. Ethan noticed the change almost immediately. When he walked to the cafe, people stared differently. Some smiled, others whispered. One man muttered, "Another fake hero." His heart sank. He pulled out his phone and saw the headlines. Did the street pianist lie? Is Ethan Cole a media creation? He scrolled endlessly. each comment cutting deeper than the last. He sat on a bench staring blankly at the screen, his dream now tangled in lies he hadn't created. That evening, Mrs. Lane called him, her voice calm but firm. "Ethan, listen to me. Don't let them break you. Truth always wins. Come to the conservatory tomorrow. The director wants to meet you." Ethan nodded silently, wiping away a tear. The next morning, he arrived at the grand building, its marble pillars and glass walls shining in the sun. He felt small but determined as he entered the director's office. A tall man with gray hair looked up and smiled kindly. "Ethan Cole," he said warmly, "I've heard your story, and I've heard your music. The world may doubt you, but talent like yours doesn't lie." He stood up and shook Ethan's hand firmly. "You belong here." Ethan felt a rush of relief, the weight of the rumors slowly lifting. He began his classes the following week, and for the first time in his life, he played on a piano that responded to every touch perfectly. No broken keys, no missing notes, just pure sound. His teachers were amazed by his natural ability. His classmates, many from wealthy families, were divided. Some admired him, others resented him. Whispers followed him in the hallways. "That's the guy who fooled the media. Maybe he's not even that good." But Ethan ignored it all. He had faced worse before, meanwhile. Mr. Grayson's anger grew. His reputation was quietly slipping. People had begun to question why he had mocked Ethan in the first place. Charity donors were pulling back. His events received less attention. His empire, built on arrogance, was showing cracks one night. He sat alone in his study, staring at the piano that stood untouched in the corner. The same one Ethan had played. He ran his hand over the keys but couldn't bring himself to play a note, because deep down he knew. He had money, but Ethan had something he'd never possess. Truth. Back at the conservatory, Ethan practiced late into the night, sometimes until his fingers ached. The janitor would pass by and shake his head with a smile. "You'll wear that piano out, kid," Ethan would laugh softly. "Let it break. As long as it keeps singing." Music had become his language, his weapon, his healing. One evening, as he was packing up, a reporter approached him in the hallway. "Ethan," she said gently, "I know the rumors hurt, but I've seen the real video, the full one, not the edited clip Grayson's team leaked. I want to publish the truth." Ethan looked at her, shocked. "You have it?" She nodded. "Yes, and people deserve to see it." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Do it." The next morning, the full story exploded online. The original footage from the party showed everything. Grayson's insults, the guests' laughter, and Ethan's stunning performance that silenced them all. The truth spread like wildfire. People apologized publicly. Messages of support flooded back. Ethan Cole truth trended worldwide. When Ethan saw the comments this time, he smiled quietly. He didn't feel angry anymore. He only felt grateful. He whispered, "Music spoke louder than lies." That same night, Mr. Grayson watched the viral video in silence, his reflection flickering on the screen. His chest felt heavy for the first time in years. He realized that all his power couldn't erase what people felt when they heard real music. He stood up and walked toward the grand piano in his study. Sitting down slowly, his fingers hesitated, then pressed a key. The sound was hollow, cold. He stopped, whispering to himself, "It doesn't sound the same anymore, Ethan." Unaware of Grayson's quiet defeat, continued his journey. His concerts now sold out, and people traveled miles to hear the boy who once played on broken keys. He never forgot where he came from, and each time he performed, he ended with the same song, the one he had played in that mansion, the song that had changed everything. The audience always stood in silence, tears in their eyes, and Ethan would smile softly, because he knew that no matter how many lies the world told, the truth in his music would always rise above them. The night of his first public concert arrived like a dream wrapped in nervous breath. Ethan stood behind the velvet curtain of the city's grandest theater, the same place where legendary musicians had performed for decades. Now it was his turn, the boy from the streets, the one who had once played on broken keys, was about to face an audience of thousands. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his jacket. The lights beyond the curtain glowed like stars. He could hear the murmuring crowd, people of all kinds, from the poorest neighborhoods to the richest families. Some came because they loved his story. Others came because they wanted to see if the miracle was real. In the front row, Mrs. Lane sat with tears already in her eyes. Proud and anxious like a mother beside her, His little sister swung her legs excitedly, whispering, "He's gonna be great." Meanwhile, in the far corner of the hall, hidden behind dark glasses and a quiet presence, Mr. Grayson sat alone, his expression unreadable. The stage manager whispered, "2 minutes." Ethan. His heart pounded louder than the noise of the crowd. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes and whispered, "Play for them." "Mom." The curtain rose slowly and a soft golden light bathed the stage. The audience erupted in applause as Ethan stepped forward, his humble figure a contrast to the luxury surrounding him. He bowed slightly, then sat before the piano, his reflection shimmering on its polished black surface. The hall fell silent, so quiet that the sound of his breathing filled the air. Ethan placed his fingers on the keys and the first note echoed. A gentle, trembling sound that carried the weight of his entire journey. He played slowly at first, the melody flowing like water, fragile yet alive, every note telling a piece of his story. The hunger. The cold nights, the laughter of the rich, the tears of the poor as the song grew. His hands moved faster, more confident. The audience leaned forward, drawn into the river of sound. The music rose and fell like the tide. It wasn't just technical perfection. It was truth turned into sound. Mr. Grayson sat unmoving, his jaw tight, his fingers pressed together. Each note seemed to hit him where words never could. The melody spoke of humility, of courage, of something he had lost long ago. He remembered the night in his mansion, Ethan's trembling hands, the mockery, and then the music that silenced everyone. As Ethan reached the peak of his performance, the air itself seemed to vibrate. The chandeliers trembled and people forgot to breathe. Some cried quietly, others closed their eyes. The music spoke to everyone differently, reminding them of lost dreams, broken promises, and second chances. Then without warning, Ethan slowed the tempo, the notes turning softer, sadder, almost like a goodbye. He looked out over the audience and saw faces shining with tears. For a moment his eyes met Mrs. Lane's. She nodded slowly, her lips whispering, "Keep going." When the final note came, it hung in the air like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Then silence, deep, heavy silence, and suddenly, the audience rose to their feet. Applause erupted, thunderous and endless. People shouted his name, some clapped until their hands hurt. It was not the applause of politeness, it was love. Ethan stood and bowed, tears glimmering in his eyes. His sister ran toward the stage and the guards let her through. She hugged him tightly. "You did it, Ethan. You made them all listen." He laughed softly, his voice shaking. "We did it," he whispered back. As the lights dimmed, Mr. Grayson quietly stood up. Unnoticed by the crowd, he walked toward the exit slowly, the applause still echoing behind him. Outside, the night air was cool. He took off his glasses and looked up at the stars. Something inside him had shifted. He remembered the first time he had ever heard music as a child. Before money and power dulled it, he had once loved it, truly loved it. But somewhere along the way, he had traded soul for control. He got into his car but didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat there listening to the faint echo of Ethan's melody drifting through the open doors of the theater. For the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears, he whispered quietly, "Forgive me, kid." Back inside, Ethan walked backstage, the walls humming with distant applause. Mrs. Lane waited for him there, smiling through her tears. "You were magnificent," she said, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Do you know what you just did?" Ethan shook his head. "You healed people tonight." "Ethan," she said softly, "your music didn't just sound beautiful, it made people remember who they are." Ethan smiled faintly. "I just played what I felt," he said, his voice tired but peaceful. Later that night, when everyone had left, Ethan stayed behind, sitting alone on the dark stage, the piano still under the spotlight. He ran his fingers over the keys gently, whispering, "Thank you," as if the instrument could hear. He didn't play this time, he just sat there, feeling the silence, feeling the weight of every moment that brought him here. In the audience seats, unnoticed by him, Mr. Grayson had returned quietly. Standing in the shadows, watching after a long silence, he spoke softly. "You changed me, Ethan." His voice low but steady. Ethan turned in surprise. The older man stepped closer, his face softer than before. "You have something I never did, purity," he said. "I spent my life buying applause. You earned it?" Ethan didn't know what to say. He simply replied, "Music doesn't belong to the rich, sir. It belongs to whoever listens with their heart." Grayson nodded slowly, his eyes moist. "Keep playing, boy, never stop," he said before turning away. His footsteps fading into the dark hall. Ethan sat there for a long time, thinking about everything, the pain, the betrayal, the victory, the forgiveness, and then he smiled, not because he had won, but because his music had finally done what it was meant to do. It had touched even the coldest heart. As the night stretched on and the last light dimmed, Ethan pressed one single key, a soft note that echoed gently into the empty hall. It was not an end. It was a promise that no matter how loud the world became, his music would always speak louder, and it would never stop. The next few months changed Ethan's life in ways he never imagined. His name spread across the country. From newspapers to television screens, people called him the soul pianist, a title that made him blush every time he heard it. Yet deep down, he remained the same humble boy who had once played on a broken keyboard by candlelight. He spent his mornings at the conservatory, studying theory, composition, and orchestration, and his nights giving small performances at charity events. He didn't care about money or fame. He only cared about making people feel something. And they did. Wherever he played, people cried, smiled, and stood in awe. One cold evening after a concert in a small town, Ethan received a letter slipped under his dressing room door. It had no sender, only his name written in neat handwriting. He unfolded it and his heart stopped. "Your music changed me. You taught me that there's more to life than pride. I want to make things right." Gee, he read it again and again, unable to believe who it was from. Mr. Grayson, the man who had tried to humiliate him, the man who once looked at him like dirt beneath his shoes, now reaching out with words of remorse. That night, Ethan sat by his piano in silence, the letter resting on the keys. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, forgiveness, confusion. They all blended together like tangled melodies. After a while, he began to play, a soft tune that carried both pain and peace. It was as if his fingers were answering the letter before his words could. A few days later, another letter arrived, this time with an address and a request. "If you can, come see me. There's something I wish to show you before it's too late." Ethan hesitated for a long time, but his heart told him to go. He believed that music wasn't just about sound. It was about understanding souls, even broken ones. The next morning, he took a train to the outskirts of the city, the winter fog rolling across the fields. The mansion that once seemed like a palace of arrogance now stood quietly, its lights dim, the grand gates slightly open. Ethan stepped inside. Memories flooding back, the laughter, the humiliation, the music that had silenced them all. A servant led him to a small study, and there sat Mr. Grayson, thinner than before, his hair grayer, his face pale, but his eyes, once filled with pride, now carried something else. "Humility and exhaustion, Ethan," he said, his voice weaker but sincere. "I didn't think you'd come." Ethan nodded quietly. "You asked me to," he said simply. Grayson gestured to the piano in the corner, the same one Ethan had played months ago. "Do you remember this?" he asked. "I used to think it made me powerful. Now I can barely look at it without remembering my shame." His voice cracked. Ethan said softly, "It's just an instrument. Sir, it's not what it plays, but who plays it." Grayson smiled faintly. "You sound like my wife," he said. "She loved music. She used to say the same thing after she passed. I stopped listening to anything beautiful. I only chased things I could own. Control, build, and when I saw you play that night, I hated you because your music reminded me of everything I'd lost." Ethan stood silent, listening, the older man's words heavy in the air. "I'm dying, Ethan." Grayson continued quietly. "My heart's failing. The doctors gave me months, maybe weeks. I've made peace with that, but not with what I did to you." His eyes glistened. "I wanted to ruin you, and instead you made me feel alive again." "I'm sorry." Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. Forgiveness isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's felt. He walked over to the piano and said gently, "Then let's play." Grayson looked up, startled. "Play?" Ethan nodded. "One last song." "Together?" The old man hesitated, then slowly got up, his fingers trembling as he sat beside Ethan. They shared the same bench, the same place where humiliation had once lived, now filled with something far greater. Ethan began softly, his left hand guiding the melody. The room filled with warmth. Grayson joined in hesitantly, missing a few notes but smiling through it, his rusty hands finding rhythm again after years. Together they played a duet of healing, not perfect, but real pure. When the last note faded, Grayson leaned back, his eyes closed, a single tear rolling down his cheek. That was peace," he whispered. Ethan smiled gently. Then that's what music was always meant for. A week later, Ethan received another letter. Short, written shakily. Thank you. Ethan, you gave me back the part of me I thought was gone forever. When I hear music now, I hear forgiveness. G. 2 days after that, Mr. Grayson passed away quietly in his sleep. The world barely noticed, but for Ethan it meant everything. He attended the small funeral. No cameras, no reporters, just silence. He placed a single white rose on the grave and whispered, "Rest easy, sir." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Lane met him at the gate, holding a folded piece of paper. "He left this for you," she said. Handing it over, inside was a legal document, and at the bottom Grayson's signature. He had donated his mansion to the city, to be turned into a free music school for underprivileged children. The top line read, "The Ethan Cole Academy of Music, where talent needs no wealth." Ethan stood frozen. Tears streaming down his face, he looked up at the gray sky and whispered, "You kept playing, sir." Months later, when the academy opened, hundreds of children walked through its doors, some barefoot, some shy, but all with light in their eyes. Ethan stood before them with his sister by his side, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "You don't need money to have music in your heart," he said. "All you need is courage to play." And as the sound of young fingers touched piano keys for the first time, Ethan closed his eyes, hearing a distant echo. The sound of forgiveness turned into melody, soft and eternal. Years passed, but the sound of that night never faded. The memory of two hands, one young and one old, playing together on that grand piano lived on in every note Ethan played. The Ethan Cole Academy of Music had become more than a building. It had become a symbol, a place where forgotten dreams found a home again. Every morning the sun poured through tall windows, falling over rows of pianos and violins. Laughter echoed through the halls as children practiced, their small fingers stumbling. Learning, growing, some were orphans, some from broken families, some too poor to afford lessons elsewhere, but here, everyone was equal. Ethan had made sure of that. He walked through the corridors with a calm smile, greeting each child by name. "Good morning, Sam. Keep going, Lila, you're almost there." The children loved him not just because he was famous, but because he listened. He made them believe that their stories mattered, that their music had worth. One day during class, a little girl with bright eyes and messy hair tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Ethan," she said softly, "my dad says music can't feed us. He says I should stop coming." Ethan knelt down, meeting her eyes. "Tell your dad," he said gently, "that music feeds the soul. And when your soul is strong, everything else follows," she smiled shyly, nodding and went back to practice. That night, after all the children had gone home, Ethan sat alone in the large auditorium. The lights dimmed. The same grand piano from the Grayson mansion sat center stage, polished, restored, still carrying the weight of countless memories. He ran his hand across the smooth surface and whispered, "You've been through so much, old friend." He played softly, his fingers gliding over the keys, the sound echoing through the empty hall. It was peaceful, almost like a conversation between him and the ghosts of the past. His mother's voice, his sister's laughter, Mr. Grayson's final smile. They all seemed to live inside the music. After he finished, he stood up and looked around the quiet hall. Framed photos of smiling children hung on the walls. Trophies from competitions they'd won lined the shelves. And on one wall, in golden letters, a plaque read, "Dedicated to the power of forgiveness, and to every heart that dares to play." Ethan touched the plaque gently, his chest tightening with emotion. He thought about how far he had come, from a poor boy with a broken keyboard to a man whose music had built a sanctuary for others. But he knew it wasn't just his doing, it was a chain of kindness, pain, and redemption that had shaped it all. A few months later, an invitation arrived for Ethan to perform at the International Peace Gala, the largest music event in the world. The organizers called him a living symbol of hope. They wanted him to perform the same song he had once played in that mansion, the one that silenced cruelty with beauty. On the night of the gala, the world watched. Millions tuned in to see the man whose music had crossed borders. Ethan walked onto the massive stage. Dressed simply as always, the crowd rose in applause. Lights shimmered across the sea of faces, and he could feel the weight of their expectations. He sat before the piano, took a deep breath, and whispered the same words he always did. "Play for them, Mom." The first note rang out, gentle but full of life, and then another, Soon the melody flowed like a story retold across generations. The music told of suffering, of laughter, of a boy who refused to give up, of a man who forgave. In the front row sat Mrs. Lane, older now but smiling proudly beside her, Ethan's sister, grown and radiant, holding a bouquet of lilies. And somewhere deep in Ethan's heart, he knew Mr. Grayson was there too, not in body, but in spirit. The man who had once tried to break him had instead built his legacy. As the final note rang through the vast hall, there was silence. Deep, reverent silence, and then thunderous applause. The audience stood, clapping, crying, cheering his name. He didn't bow right away. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart and looked up at the ceiling, as if thanking something beyond himself. Later, backstage, reporters crowded around him. "Ethan, how does it feel to have changed the world through your music?" One asked. Ethan smiled softly and said, "I didn't change the world. I just reminded it to listen again." The crowd went silent for a moment, and even the cameras seemed to pause, capturing the quiet truth in his words. That night, as he returned home, the city lights sparkled like 1,000 memories. He walked through the empty halls of his academy, hearing faint echoes of laughter and music, and then he noticed something new. One of his students had left a small handwritten note on his piano. It said, "Dear Mr. Ethan, when I grow up, I want to play like you. But more than that, I want to feel like you do when you play. Thank you for giving me music." Ethan smiled. His eyes glistening, he sat down and began to play again. A new melody this time, one filled with peace, love, and continuity. The sound floated out through the open windows into the night air, carrying his story into the world once more. Outside, the city slept under a quiet sky, unaware that inside a humble music hall, a legacy was alive. A legacy born not from pride, but from pain turned into beauty, from cruelty turned into kindness, from humiliation turned into harmony. As the final notes faded, Ethan looked up at the stars and whispered, "For every soul that ever doubted its worth, and keep playing." And somewhere, perhaps far away, perhaps in another world, a faint echo answered him, like a distant chord of approval, gentle, eternal, and full of light. The music of forgiveness had never truly ended. It had simply found a new beginning.